"Pick that up, sweetheart." Those were the words Dr. Hargrove had been practicing for 3 weeks, waiting for the moment to say them. They didn't know she'd already survived worse than his contempt. They didn't know that the woman in oversized scrubs, moving like smoke through the cardiac wing, had sewn men back together in sandstorms with supplies from a field pack. The hospital board would find out in exactly 14 days. Mercy General in Savannah had no idea what was standing in the supply room on a Tuesday night. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. Brooke Sullivan arrived for her first night shift at Mercy General on a Tuesday in March, when the hospital corridors had that particular hollow feel, maintenance crews mopping floors that gleamed like dark mirrors, the urgent beeping of monitors dampened to something almost contemplative. She carried a single canvas bag, worn soft at the corners, and wore scrubs 2 sizes too large, the kind that let her move without restriction. Most people would have assumed she was nervous, that the baggy fabric was camouflage for insecurity. They would have been wrong. The cardiac wing smelled like antiseptic and industrial soap, with a faint copper undertone from the trauma bay 2 floors down. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead, and the ventilators wheezed in synchronized patterns from the monitored beds. Brooke moved through the space without hesitating, her worn combat boots, lace-tight, desert tan, with a faint red dust still embedded in the sole creases, landing soundlessly on the linoleum despite their weight. The boots were oversized for the hospital. Smaller shoes would have been easier. She kept them anyway, wrapped in purple heart ribbon at the bottom of her locker. Some things you didn't abandon, even when nobody was watching. Her first patient was a 73-year-old man named Walter, post-op from a routine valve replacement, his vitals steady but cautious. Brooke read his chart with the intensity of someone decoding a message, every notation, every dosage, every monitor trend absorbed into a mental map. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles and along the palms in patterns that didn't match any standard injury, moved with the economy of someone who'd learned efficiency in places where wasted motion meant blood loss. She checked his foresight, confirmed the line integrity, and adjusted his fluids with the kind of precise calculation that came from thousands of repetitions, most of them not in hospitals. That's when Dr. Hargrove saw her. He stood in the doorway of the patient's room, clipboard clutched against his chest, and watched Brooke's hands as she worked. Her movements were too controlled, too efficient. The way her fingers touched the catheter hub, just enough pressure, no wasted motion, the confidence of someone who knew exactly what would happen before it happened. There was something military about the precision, something that didn't fit the profile of a quiet night shift nurse who'd been working at Mercy General for 3 weeks. Hargrove had built his career on reading hierarchies, on identifying threats to the institutional order he'd cultivated over 15 years. He identified one now. "Excellent work," he said, his voice carrying the temperature of a walk-in freezer. Brooke didn't look up from the floor. "Thank you, Doctor." Hargrove lingered in the doorway, his presence like a change in air pressure, and studied her with the calculation of someone making an important decision. He was 58, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that still held its angles, but something in his expression had hardened it into something else. His suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore it the way people wear power. 15 years of being the smartest man in every room had calcified into certainty. He walked away thinking about what he'd seen. Not what he could see. What he'd missed. 3 hours later, in the break room at 2:19 a.m., Hargrove made his move. The room held 6 nurses coming off their shifts and 2 residents hunched over coffee that had been hot sometime in the previous century. Hargrove entered with the kind of casual authority that commanded attention without announcement, moving to the refrigerator as if he owned it. He pulled out a bottle of expensive mineral water and turned to face the room, his expression carrying something between amusement and certainty. "I'm giving it a week," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The new night shift nurse. "Brooke, is it? She'll quit within 7 days. Maximum." Nobody asked why. They didn't need to. Hargrove had established the rules of his hospital the way generals establish territory, with enough casual cruelty that people learned not to question. One of the nurses, a woman named Rachel who'd worked with Brooke on 2 shifts, opened her mouth to say something. Hargrove's expression tightened just slightly. Rachel closed her mouth. She's not equipped for this work, Hargrove continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something obvious to children. Quiet people don't survive night shift. Quiet people don't last in this environment. And quiet people especially don't last under pressure. He took a long drink of his water, and someone in the room actually shifted their weight. 7 days, maximum. I'll stake my golf handicap on it. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. Brooke was in the medication room when she heard this, separated from the break room by 2 walls and 40 feet of corridor. The door was slightly ajar. She was counting controlled substances, a routine that required intense focus and documentation, the kind of task that demanded precision. Her hands continued their work, 10 milligrams morphine ampules, 12 confirmed, serial number logged, while her mind processed what she was hearing with the same cold efficiency. She didn't pause. She didn't stop counting. Her hands remained steady as she verified the next dosage vial, her fingers steady as stone, her expression unreadable as she moved through the pharmaceutical inventory. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and somewhere down the corridor, a heart monitor beeped its metronome rhythm. Brooke checked the next line on her log with a pen that moved across the paper in controlled, precise strokes. She heard Hargrove's laugh die away. She heard the break room door open and close. She heard the hospital shift into its 2:44 a.m. rhythm, that strange suspended moment between night and morning when the world felt compressed, when anything could happen and nobody would be surprised. Brooke finished her count. She locked the medication room. She returned to her patient assignment, her vitals, her charts. Her composure had never flickered. The slight tension in her jaw when she heard the words "quit within a week" was the only indication that she'd heard anything at all, and she'd controlled it before anyone could see. The combat boots made no sound on the linoleum as she walked back to the cardiac wing. Walter was sleeping, his monitors steady, his oxygen saturation holding at 97%. Brooke checked him anyway, not because her assignment required it, but because she'd learned in a war zone that protocol was what kept people alive when everything else failed. She adjusted his blanket with careful, deliberate movements that came from a muscle memory that didn't belong in a hospital. Her hands, scarred and capable, moved with the kind of precision that comes from having stitched wounds closed in a field tent while counting down minutes before a medevac helicopter could arrive. She didn't think about Hargrove's bet. That was the thing about having survived what she'd survived, you learned the difference between threats and noise. A doctor's ego was noise. A man bleeding out in Helmand Province was a threat. This was noise. Still, as she stood at her station 40 minutes later, charting her notes in the electronic system, Brooke felt something shift. Not fear. Something older than fear. The sensation that came right before everything changed. She'd felt it before, in a convoy moving toward Sanjin Valley, in a briefing room when someone made a casual comment about an operation going sideways, in the pause before a commander used words like classified and need to know. The night stretched ahead of her, long and quiet and full of the kind of suspended waiting that came with hospital work at 2:27 a.m. Hargrove had made his calculations. He'd announced his certainty to a room full of people. He'd drawn a line in the sand and marked the end point. What he didn't know was that Brooke Sullivan had been crossed before, and she was still standing. The break room at 2 in the morning smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of people running on fumes. Brooke stood at the counter, pouring her third cup, when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade. He was speaking to the cluster of nurses and residents near the doorway, loud enough for the entire station to hear, loud enough for the words to travel down the hallway and back. I'm giving our new recruit 1 week before she quits. Any takers on that bet? 6 nurses. 2 residents. All of them waiting to see what she'd do. Brooke turned slowly, one measured breath filling her lungs. She set the pot down. Her eyes met his across the break room, and she didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't offer him the reaction he was hunting for. Hargrove smiled, the smile of a man convinced he'd already won. Nothing to say, sweetheart? Smart. The word hung in the air like poison gas. A single tear escaped down her cheek, unexpected and unwanted. Brooke wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, her jaw clenching once, hard. When she spoke, her voice emerged like cold steel drawn from ice water. "I don't gamble, doctor. I just work." The room went dead silent. Someone's badge clattered against the wall. Hargrove's expression flickered, confusion, then anger that he tried to bury under a forced laugh. He turned away, but the other nurses had seen something in that moment. They'd heard something. The quiet girl wasn't quiet. She was still. For days passed. Routine shifts. 12-hour stretches for insertions, medication checks, patient rounds. Brooke moved through Mercy General like someone who belonged there, her hand steady, her charting meticulous. On day 12, Hargrove struck. The nurse's station became his hunting ground. He flagged 3 of her charts, medication timings off by 90 seconds, documentation formatted in a different style than the departmental preference, a note about a patient's family meeting phrased too informally. 90 seconds. A formatting choice. The way a human being spoke. He CC'd the chief of surgery on an email, copying it to Patricia Wainwright, the hospital board member. Hargrove played 18 holes with every other Sunday. The email read like a clinical observation. Ms. Sullivan demonstrates concerning gaps in attention to detail and protocol compliance. Recommend performance review before assignment to complex cases. Brooke saw it pop into her inbox while she was checking a post-surgical patient's drain output. She read it once. Didn't respond. Didn't argue. Filed the corrections with the same precision she applied to everything else. But Hargrove was watching. He stood at the nurse's station, loud enough for her to hear, speaking to one of the residents. "Some people just aren't cut out for real hospital work. They mean well, but the rigor is too much." His voice carried the weight of institutional authority. He wasn't being cruel, he was just stating facts. That was the weapon. Not the cruelty, but the appearance of objectivity. That night, alone in the supply closet, Brooke let her hands shake for exactly 45 seconds. She counted them. Then she straightened her scrubs, washed her face at the sink, and walked back out. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the knowledge of exactly what she was capable of doing and choosing not to. She'd been here before, in different uniforms, different countries, different kinds of wars. Day 19 arrived grey and humid, the kind of Savannah afternoon where the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The cafeteria at Mercy General hummed with the usual chaos, staff grabbing lunch between rounds, visitors holding styrofoam cups of coffee, the smell of disinfectant mixing with something vaguely like food. Brooke carried her tray, salad, water, a protein bar, toward a table near the corner. Simple. Fuel. She didn't expect combat in the cafeteria. That was her mistake. Hargrove stood abruptly as she passed his table. His movement was deliberate, angled. His arm swung up in a motion that almost looked accidental, almost looked clumsy. Brooke's tray flew from her hands. The salad container exploded across the tile floor. The water bottle bounced and rolled. Plastic clattering. Glass scraping. 30 staff members stopped moving. The room became a held breath. Hargrove smiled, the smile of a man who'd finally drawn blood. He dropped a patient chart at her feet, his voice carrying across the entire cafeteria with the precision of an instrument. "Pick that up, sweetheart. While you're down there." The words hung in the air like a bell struck in a closed room. Some of the younger nurses looked away. Some looked toward her, waiting to see which version of Brooke Sullivan they'd get, the one who would break, or the one who would comply. She took one measured breath. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When she opened them again, she was looking at Hargrove, not the spilled food. A single tear escaped without warning, the body betraying what the mind refused to allow. She wiped it away with her thumb, her gaze never wavering from his face, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged could have frozen fire. "I've sewn men back together in sandstorms, doctor. Your tantrums don't impress me. The words were quiet, low, but they carried the weight of someone who had seen actual darkness and refused to be diminished by the shadows of a hospital break room. Hargrove's face flushed red, real red, not the controlled anger from before. He forced a laugh that sounded like gravel in a disposal unit and turned away, walking back toward the exit with the posture of a man who'd realized his power was less certain than he'd believed. But as he left the cafeteria, his phone was already in his hand. His expression had changed. The confident predator had become something else entirely, a man reassessing his prey, wondering what he'd missed. That night, in his office on the 3rd floor, Hargrove sat in darkness lit only by his desk lamp. He had already called Patricia Wainwright and 2 other board members, planting seeds with surgical precision. I'm just concerned about her credentials. For such a complex case load. All her references check out, but something feels off. You know. The voices on the other end of the phone had murmured agreement. Of course they'd agreed. The institutional machinery was easier to move than it seemed. Now he was compiling a file. Education history. Employment records. He pulled up her listed references and began dialing. The first number was disconnected. So was the second. The third number, from something called the Medical Call Liaison, Kabul sector, rang once and went to a government voicemail system that took no messages. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He hung up without leaving anything. He sat in the darkness of his office, the glow of his computer illuminating his face, and made a note in his phone, check military databases, Sullivan, combat medic. He saved it. He closed his eyes. And somewhere in the back of his mind, something whispered that he'd made a mistake. He didn't listen to it. That was his second mistake. But Hargrove wasn't the only one paying attention. In the ICU, in the supply room, in the quiet corridors of Mercy General, people had witnessed the cafeteria. People had heard what Brooke said. And the next shift brought a storm that would shatter everything he'd built. The patient in bed 7 was dying, and Brooke knew it the moment she stepped into the ICU. His name was Marcus Webb, 63 years old, admitted 3 days prior with acute myocardial infarction. His breathing had changed. The quality of the sound, the lag between each inhale, the way his shoulders hitched upward instead of his chest expanding. Tension pneumothorax, maybe. Or pericardial effusion, fluid around the heart, pressure building, squeezing the cardiac chambers until they couldn't fill. Blood pressure 87/54. Dropping. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia, heart rate climbing past 110 as his body fought for survival, and Webb's eyes carried that particular terror of a drowning man whose water was his own blood. Call Dr. Hargrove, the night supervisor said, her voice steady but her hands moving too fast, checking the 4 line again though nothing had changed in the last 60 seconds. Get cardio down here. Brooke was already moving. She didn't wait for orders or clearance or the hierarchy that usually governed these moments. Her hands knew what to do. They'd known for 18 years. She pulled the ultrasound machine from its dock with the fluid economy of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, the wheel squeaking against linoleum as she positioned it beside Webb's bed. His chest was already exposed, the EKG lead stuck to his pale skin like a spider web of surveillance. I'm placing the probe, Brooke said. Her voice was flat, clinical, a different register entirely from the deferential whisper she'd adopted for 3 weeks. This was the voice of someone who'd made decisions that determined whether men lived or died. Everyone stand back. She didn't ask. She commanded. The difference was absolute. The ultrasound transducer found the parasternal long axis in 2 movements. One sweep. The image bloomed on the monitor, the heart, grey and flickering, chambers contracting but slowly, weakly, like a fist that couldn't quite close. And around it, visible as a black crescent moon of fluid, the pericardial effusion. Not massive, not yet, but enough. Enough to be fatal in the next 4 minutes. Tamponade, Brooke said. She was already opening the crash cart, her fingers finding the kit without looking, a 16-gauge needle, a 6-inch catheter, the local anesthetic syringe already drawn with lidocaine. We don't have 4 minutes. Where's Hargrove? Someone asked. A resident, young, his voice climbing toward panic. Brooke didn't answer. She was already marking the insertion point, 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process, the needle angling 45 degrees toward Webb's left shoulder. The angle was critical. Too steep and she'd lacerate the myocardium. Too shallow and she'd miss the fluid pocket entirely. There was no margin. There never was. She prepped the site with betadine in a practice spiral, the antiseptic pooling in the hollow between his ribs. Her left hand steadied Webb's chest wall, fingers finding the rib landmarks by feel alone. Her right hand held the needle like a surgeon, like a weapon, like salvation. Deep breath, she told Webb. Not a request. Not now. He inhaled. His lungs expanded against the pressure, the fluid shifting microscopically. She felt it through her fingertips. The needle went in. The angle true. The resistance of the pericardium giving way, a subtle pop, like puncturing the skin on heated caramel. She advanced the catheter, felt the sudden gush of fluid into the vacuum syringe she held in her left hand. Dark blood. Venous pressure bleeding into the pericardial sac. She withdrew it slowly, steadily, watching the monitor. Blood pressure climbing. 88. 92. 100. Heart rate dropping. 118, 105. 98. Oxygen saturation coming up, the respiratory therapist whispered, watching her own monitor with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle. 91%. 94. Steady. Brooke secured the catheter with sutures, careful work, precise work, the kind of work she'd performed in the back of a Humvee at 3 in the morning while mortar rounds echoed across Helmand Province. The thread slid through the puncture sites with a faint resistance. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. When it was finished, she stepped back. Webb's breathing had returned to normal. His shoulders dropped. His eyes, which had been wide with the particular clarity of a man watching death approach, softened. Relief. Gratitude. The deep exhaustion of someone who'd survived. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the ICU doorway, his expression unreadable, taking in the scene, the ultrasound machine still at bedside, the used syringe on the tray, the secured catheter, the patient's vital signs normalizing on the monitor. 2 minutes too late. Brooke was cleaning up, disposing of the used supplies with the same efficient movement she'd used everywhere else. She didn't look at Hargrove. She didn't acknowledge his presence at all. I saved his life, one of the nurses said quietly to another, watching Brooke work. Oh my God, did you see that? She knew exactly what she was doing, the second nurse finished. Webb slept for 20 minutes, the sedation pulling him under as his body recovered from trauma. When he woke, his eyes tracked immediately to Brooke as she adjusted his fore. His gaze dropped to her hands, specifically to the central line she'd placed on admission, 3 days prior. The suture work was intricate, meticulous, the stitches so fine they looked almost delicate on his weathered chest. He stared at the line for nearly 30 seconds without speaking. His hand came up slowly, and he reached toward it, not touching but examining the work the way a jeweler might examine a setting. His eyes lifted to meet hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, a smoker's voice, a voice that had been used hard in places with names that didn't appear on American maps. You, he said. Brooke continued checking his vitals, her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago not to engage with patients' post-operative confusion. Delirium was common. The brain struggling to process trauma. Sanjin Valley, Webb continued, his voice gaining strength. 2014, Phi Base Nightingale. His hand trembled as he reached again, this time pointing directly at the suture work with an index finger that had yellowed from nicotine and age. That's your stitch pattern. Nobody does the modified mattress stitch like that anymore. You were the medic they called Ghost. You took shrapnel out of a guy's heart with a pocket knife. I was there. I watched you do it. Sergeant First Class, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The monitors continued their rhythm. The 4 pumps hissed. Someone in the next bay coughed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their constant, invisible frequency, a sound Brooke had long ago trained herself not to hear. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't drop her hand from his wrist where she was still checking his pulse. "You should rest, Mr. Webb," she said. Her voice was level as concrete. "Your heart's been through trauma." "They said you were dead," he continued, his eyes moving from her hands to her face. "Pentagon briefing, 2015. Said the medical team went AWOL, that you all were compromised, that," he stopped. Understanding crystallized across his weathered face. "You weren't dead. They erased you." Brooke placed his hand gently back on the bed, adjusted his blanket with the precision of someone tucking in a child, and said, "I need to check on your neighbors, Mr. Webb. You rest." But she could feel his eyes on her back as she walked away, carrying the weight of recognition like it was something physical, something that had mass and gravity and the power to change everything. Dr. Hargrove stood in the nurse's station, watching her return. She met his eyes directly, and for the first time in 3 weeks, there was no deference in her face. The submissiveness that had characterized every interaction had evaporated like water on a hot surface. What remained was someone entirely different. Someone whose composure wasn't practiced politeness but the carefully maintained control of someone who'd learned to survive in environments where a single mistake meant someone died. He looked away first. 30 seconds of silence passed. Then Hargrove turned and walked toward his office. But before he closed the door, Brooke heard him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. "Patricia, it's Hargrove. We have a situation. I need you to see something on the security feed." A pause. "The hallway. From tonight. I'm uploading it to the secure server. Pull it up when you get a chance." Another pause, his voice dropping further. "She's not what she said she was. Not even close." The call ended. But that wasn't the worst part. Tuesday at 11:53 p.m., the cardiac wing hallway erupted. A man 6'8", muscular as a freight train, blood dripping from his knuckles where he'd punched through a vending machine on the 2nd floor, stumbled through the double doors screaming. His eyes had the glassy, feral quality of someone riding a PCP wave, dilated pupils, skin flushed crimson, movements jerky and uncontrolled. He hurled a crash cart against the wall. The metal shrieked. Equipment scattered across the tile like shrapnel. A nurse at the station jumped backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "I need painkillers. I need them now." His voice was gravel and fury mixed together. "My hands are on fire. My hands are burning and nobody's helping me." Security arrived, 2 men in Navy uniforms, both solid but not trained for what they were seeing. The moment they stepped forward, the man turned and grabbed a portable defibrillator, held it like a weapon. They stopped. Hesitated. That hesitation was everything. One of them looked back toward the administrative corridor where Dr. Hargrove's office Saturday. Hargrove appeared in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, saw the chaos, saw the size of the man, saw the raw violence radiating off him like heat, and retreated into his office, closing the door with the soft click of someone removing himself from accountability. Brooke was 3 rooms away, checking a post-op cardiac patient's monitor, her eyes tracking the vital signs climbing steadily back into normal range. She heard the crash. She heard the screaming. She didn't pause. Her hands continued their work, checking the dressing on the sternotomy incision, verifying the rate on the drip, documenting the numbers in the chart with the precision of someone writing a permanent record. Only when the second crash came, louder, did her head lift. She set down her pen. Looked at the nurse frozen at the station. Looked at security, rooted in place. Looked at the man now throwing a rolling stool. It tumbled end over end and exploded against a window, the tempered glass holding but spiderwebbing from the impact. She walked toward him. Not quickly. Not in panic. The way someone walks to an appointment they're not rushing for. Her badge caught the fluorescent light as she moved. Her scrubs were still pristine, no blood, no sweat, the fabric moving with the calm of someone whose body was perfectly regulated. Security tried to step in front of her. She raised one hand. That was all it took. They parted. The man turned toward her. His pupils dilated even wider when he saw her, recognizing her as a target because she was there, because she was moving, because the drug in his system was telling him that pain was something you solved with force. "You a nurse?" His words slurred together. "I am," Brooke said. He came at her with his fists raised, not a boxer's stance but something uglier, the swinging brutality of a man whose strength had always solved his problems until the moment it wouldn't anymore. His right hand came toward her face with enough velocity to break orbital bone. She moved. Her hands went up, her left palm catching his right wrist and rotating it. Not stopping it, rotating it. The brachial plexus is a network of nerves running down the inside of the arm, and when you compress it at the right angle, the entire limb stops functioning. His arm went dead. He screamed. In that same moment her right leg swept his left knee inward, and his body followed the geometry of what was happening, his balance dissolved. He fell. She was already positioned behind him, her forearm across his throat, not tight enough to crush but tight enough to control. A rear-naked choke. Her free hand locked her own wrist. Textbook form. It was over in 4 seconds. His body went slack. Unconscious. His breathing continued, normal and steady. She checked his airway, tilted his head slightly to the side to prevent aspiration, and stood. Her pulse hadn't accelerated. Her breathing was even. She looked at security. "Call EMS. Sedation hold. Psychiatric evaluation." The orders came out flat, clinical, delivered as statements rather than requests. She turned to the post-op nurse. "Continue vitals every 15 minutes. Call me if anything changes." She walked back to her patient. Security stared. One of them reached for his radio. The other was already on his phone requesting an ambulance. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. In the distance, a heart monitor beeped steadily, the rhythm that meant a patient was alive, the rhythm that meant something had worked. By 11:17 p.m., the man was sedated and strapped to a psychiatric hold bed. By 11:43 p.m., EMS had transported him to a facility equipped for PCP intoxication cases. By midnight, the hallway had been cleaned. The equipment returned to stations. The window damage photographed for insurance. The incident report filed. Brooke finished her shift at 7:33 a.m. Wednesday morning. She didn't see Hargrove leave his office. Didn't see him on his personal cell phone at 6:44 a.m., calling Patricia Wainwright, the hospital board president, mid-round at the Savannah Golf Club. She didn't hear him say her name with the precise tone of someone who had been planning this moment since the cafeteria. But she felt it coming, that shift in air pressure that means something large is moving toward you. By 7:15 a.m., an outside investigator named Reynolds was being contacted. By 7:13 a.m., every reference number Brooke had listed on her employment application was being called, and every one of them disconnected, dead-end, disconnected from anything verifiable. By 7:45 a.m., Hargrove was pulling her medical records from the Mercy General database and highlighting every case she'd touched, flagging them for pattern review. He was building a case the way architects build structures, with specificity, with documentation, with the cold competence of someone who had done this before and knew exactly which institutional levers to pull. At 8:22 a.m., Brooke was walking toward the administrator's office because Patricia Wainwright's assistant had caught her in the hallway and delivered the message with the tone of someone delivering a subpoena. "They're ready for you." Conference room. 2nd floor. The door was already open. Patricia Wainwright sat at the head of a polished oak table. To her right, an empty chair. To her left, Dr. Hargrove. Beside him, Reynolds, the investigator, his suit expensive but not ostentatious, his notepad already filled with handwriting. Brooke could see her name repeated down the margins. "Ms. Sullivan," Patricia said, her voice careful. "Please sit." Brooke Saturday. her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes forward. Every part of her absolutely still. Reynolds didn't waste time. He placed a laptop in front of them and hit play. Security footage. The hallway. The chaos. The man hurtling toward her, his fists raised. Then, in slow motion, her hands rising, the rotation of his wrist, his arm going dead. The leg sweep. The choke. His body surrendering. This appears to be military combat training, Ms. Sullivan. Reynolds paused the footage on the moment of the brachial plexus strike, her hand position absolutely textbook. Where did you acquire these skills? Brooke took one measured breath. I protected a patient. You have no credentials for security functions, Hargrove interjected, his voice sharp with satisfaction. No training clearance. No background for this type of intervention. I'm a registered nurse. I acted to prevent harm. Your references don't verify, Reynolds said, flipping pages. 3 of them are disconnected numbers. 2 are deceased, according to our research, 1 died in 2009. The others have no employment records that match the timeline you provided. Employment gaps in your file are substantial. Over 17 years, we found only fragmented contracts with medical organizations, none of which have official records of your work. This is highly irregular. Hargrove's face had the expression of someone who had won already. We've reviewed every case you touched since your arrival. 7 complex cardiac procedures. A level 1 trauma that you assisted on. We're flagging all of them for potential liability. Your takedown of the patient last night was excessive force. That man required psychiatric intervention, not physical assault. He was a danger to staff, Brooke said. That's a matter for interpretation, Patricia said quietly. She wasn't looking at Brooke. She was looking at the medals. No, looking past them, toward the windows, toward anywhere her eyes didn't have to land. The board takes these concerns very seriously. Reynolds closed his notepad. Immediate termination, pending investigation. You're to surrender your credentials, your badge, and any hospital property. This is effective immediately. Brooke's jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. But something inside her folded, the part of her that had believed she could have a normal life. The part that had thought she could be just a nurse, just a person who went to work and came home and existed in the world without all of this following her. She stood. May I retrieve my belongings? By noon, her locker was empty. Her badge deactivated. Her name removed from the staff directory. A security officer walked her to her car, not hostile, just procedural. She drove home in silence, still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the stethoscope around her neck that suddenly felt like evidence. That night, her 15-year-old son Jason found her at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, and the moment he saw her face, the moment he saw the combat boots sitting beside her, medals still wrapped around them, something shifted in his teenage understanding of who his mother was. He'd never seen her like this. Never seen her anything but steady, anything but whole. Mom, why are you home early? What happened? She couldn't answer. She couldn't explain that the government had told her never to surface, that she'd been officially erased from military records after a classified operation in Helmand Province had gone sideways and someone in the Pentagon had needed it to disappear. She couldn't tell him that defending herself meant exposing secrets that were bigger than her, bigger than this hospital, bigger than Savannah. She couldn't tell him anything at all. Just a bad day, sweetie. Just a bad day. He stared at her shaking hands. At the boots. At the medals glinting dull gold in the kitchen light. And then, as if something had clicked inside him, as if some piece of teenage intuition had suddenly assembled itself into clarity, he stood up and walked to her closet. He pulled down her old gym bag, the one she never used. He dug deeper. His hands found the showbox hidden behind the winter clothes, the one she'd kept wrapped in an old army t-shirt, unreachable, unspoken, buried. He carried it to the kitchen. Wednesday morning arrived with the fluorescent hallway lights casting everything in institutional white. Brooke sat in the administrator's office, Patricia Wainwright's space, all mahogany and diplomas, as the outside investigator presented his findings. The report was 12 pages. Hargrove had been thorough. He sat across from her, his posture relaxed, confident, the smile on his face like a predator that had already won the hunt. The takedown itself, the investigator said, sliding photographs across the desk, exceeds necessary force parameters. The patient posed a threat, yes, but Ms. Sullivan responded with techniques that appear to be, shall we say, military in origin. That level of training isn't typical for nursing staff. Hargrove's eyes never left her face, searching for a crack, a tremor, anything that would confirm she was breaking. Brooke kept her breathing steady. One measured inhale. One measured exhale. The room smelled of old leather and Patricia's expensive perfume, something that made her think of boardrooms and decisions already made. There's also the question, the investigator continued, of her references. 2 are deceased. 1 phone number is no longer in service. The 3rd doesn't appear to exist. Patricia Wainwright's expression shifted, disappointment, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. But Hargrove leaned back in his chair, and that was when Brooke understood. He didn't need her references to be verifiable. He just needed them to be questioned. He needed her to be questioned. He needed her gone before anyone asked the right questions. Based on this investigation, Patricia said slowly, and the documented pattern of concerning decisions, we've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Your badge will be deactivated. You'll collect your personal items from your locker under supervision. We'll mail your final check. Hargrove smiled. Brooke didn't. She stood, her movements precise as a surgical instrument, and walked toward the door without responding. Behind her, she heard Hargrove say something to Patricia about dodging a bullet, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never once considered that consequences could find him. Within 48 hours, her locker was empty. Her badge had been deactivated. She'd tried it on a whim that afternoon just to confirm the finality, and the red light and soft beep had felt like a door closing on a version of herself she'd only just begun to construct. The hospital's IT system no longer recognized her. She was erased from the scheduling software, the payroll database, the access logs. It was efficient work. It was also, she understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been disappeared before, the standard procedure for someone whose background didn't survive scrutiny. She couldn't fight it because fighting it would require explanation. She couldn't explain because her service was classified, buried under national security protocols that made her official existence a liability rather than an asset. That night, she sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still wearing them because she hadn't yet been able to move, to shower, to acknowledge that the shift had ended. Jason found her there at 7 in the evening, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her eyes focused on nothing. He was 15, old enough to know when something had fractured. Mom. His voice carried that particular quality of adolescent uncertainty, too old for blind acceptance, too young to have learned how to stand at a distance from other people's pain. Why are you home? You're supposed to be working. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't explain that she'd been terminated, that Hargrove had won, that the careful architecture she'd built, the quiet competence, the precision, the way she'd begun to fit into the hospital's rhythms, had all collapsed because one man had decided she was a threat. She couldn't explain because the truth was classified, compartmentalized, locked behind non-disclosure agreements and official secrets acts. She could only tell him that she'd lost her job and that she couldn't explain why, and watch his face move through confusion and anger and something that looked like betrayal. He left the kitchen without speaking. 20 minutes later, she heard him moving through the house, his footsteps deliberate, purposeful. She should have asked what he was doing. Instead, she sat with her cold coffee and remembered the last time she'd felt this helpless, a night in Helmand Province when an extraction order was countermanded by someone in Washington, and people she'd been supposed to protect died because of chains of command and classified reasons she was never allowed to discuss. The showbox appeared on the table beside her, and Brooke's breath stopped. It was old, weathered, the kind of container that had survived years of careful hiding, under winter coats, behind storage boxes, in the back of a closet she'd thought was sufficiently private. Inside, wrapped in the worn fabric of an Army PT shirt, were the medals. The Bronze Star. The Purple Heart, 2 of them, actually, the second one wrapped separately as if he'd known which one carried the heavier story. And beneath them, commendations. Citations for Vayler. Names of operations she still wasn't allowed to discuss in detail. What is this? Jason's voice was different now. Older. Steadier. Mom, what is this? Brooke reached for the medals, but her hand stopped before they made contact. Jason, you need to put those back. No. He lifted the Bronze Star, and the light caught the ribbon. No, I don't. I'm done pretending you're just a nurse who got fired for no reason. What is this? Who are you? She opened her mouth. Closed it. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the kitchen window. In that moment of illumination, she saw her son clearly, not the 15-year-old boy anymore, but something else. Something that looked like determination. Something that looked like he'd already decided he was going to find the truth whether she gave it to him or not. Put them back, she said again, and her voice was steady, which was somehow worse. Please. He didn't. He left them on the table between them, a barrier made of her own history, and went upstairs to his room. Brooke sat alone with the medals she'd spent 18 years hiding, and for the first time since Hargrove had forced her into a corner, she let the exhaustion show. Not on her face. Not in her breathing. But in the way her hand trembled when it reached for the Bronze Star, and then pulled back, and then reached again. Thursday morning arrived like an interrogation. The hospital board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the conference room on the 3rd floor. Brooke woke to the sound of Jason moving through the house with an intensity she hadn't heard from him in years, not a child's carelessness, but a young man's purpose. He showered. He dressed in clean clothes, the dark jeans and the button-down shirt he wore for school presentations. He carried the showbox down the stairs with the careful reverence of someone bearing something sacred. "You're not going," Brooke said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going." He held the showbox the way someone might hold a detonation device. Controlled. Deliberate. They need to know who you are. Jason, if you do this. You've been hiding for 18 years. His voice didn't crack. I'm not letting you hide anymore. He left the house before she could stop him. She considered following, considered the violation of every protocol, every oath, every classified agreement that made her existence something that should remain silent and erased. But she understood something in that moment that she'd been running from since Helmand Province. The isolation had a cost, and the cost was being paid by everyone around her. She called Mercy General's main line from the car, asking when the board meeting would conclude. They told her 10:30. She had time to change. Time to prepare. Time to understand that the careful construction of her hidden self was about to be dismantled by a 15-year-old boy with medals and a showbox. The board conference room was crowded when she arrived, not just Patricia Wainwright and the administrator, but representatives from the hospital's legal counsel, insurance, and what appeared to be an FBI agent in a dark suit. Jason was already there, standing at the head of the table, his hands shaking now that she could see them, the showbox open, medals glinting under the harsh institutional lights. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression, relief, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that this moment belonged to them both. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan," he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone speaking truth into a room that had been built on lies. The silence that followed was absolute. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Someone's phone buzzed, then was quickly silenced. Patricia Wainwright reached for the first medal, her hands moving slowly, as if she was touching something she feared might burn her. She picked up the Bronze Star, and her eyes widened. The administrator began reading aloud from a document, citations, dates, operations described in the restrained language of official military records. Vayler under fire. Extraction of high-value assets. Multiple tours. Multiple injuries sustained in performance of duty. A man stood at the back of the room, tall, built like the ocean itself had been compressed into human form, his bearing the particular posture of someone accustomed to giving orders. Commander Hayes. SEAL Team 3. He'd served with Brooke in Helmand, though that particular detail wasn't mentioned aloud. He named each medal as it was lifted from the box. Bronze Star for actions during Operation Iron Whirlwind. Purple Heart, Sanjin Valley, 2009. Purple Heart, Jozjan Province, 2011. Navy Commendation for Valor. His voice was steady, ceremonial, the kind of voice that made even the skeptical people in the room understand that what they were witnessing was legitimate. But that wasn't the worst part. An FBI liaison introduced herself as Special Agent Patricia Ruiz, and she delivered the final blow to Hargrove's narrative with the precision of a missile strike. Senior Chief Sullivan was instrumental in a classified operation that resulted in the extraction of 17 high-value intelligence assets from terrorist cells operating in the northern provinces. Her identity has been protected under national security protocols that Dr. Hargrove's investigation into her background may have compromised. Agent Ruiz's expression was grim. Accessing restricted military databases without authorization carries significant penalties. Marcus Chen, the hospital's IT director, a Marine Corps veteran with 17 years of service, entered the conference room carrying a laptop. His jaw was tight, his eyes the color of corroded steel. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete security footage from the hallway incident at 6:08 a.m. on Wednesday. I intercepted the deletion request and preserved every frame. He turned the laptop so the board could see. The footage played in silence, the massive patient, the sudden violence, Brooke's response. For seconds. A precision strike to the brachial plexus that disrupted neural signals without breaking bone. A leg sweep that took him down without impact trauma. A rear naked choke applied with the exact pressure necessary to render him unconscious without restricting blood flow. The footage showed what it actually was, a life-saving technique executed with elite-level training, the kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly how much force is necessary and refusing to apply more. Commander Hayes spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence. That technique is taught to special operations medics for patient extraction under hostile conditions. It's designed to neutralize a threat while preserving the subject's life. That's not excessive force. That's restraint. That's the kind of decision-making you learn when lives depend on your precision. He looked directly at Patricia Wainwright. You fired someone for doing exactly what someone with her training is supposed to do. The vote came swiftly. Dr. Hargrove was suspended immediately pending investigation into evidence tampering, harassment, and abuse of institutional authority. His medical license was flagged for review by the state board. Patricia Wainwright resigned from the board. Legal counsel began the process of reviewing every performance evaluation Hargrove had conducted, every chart he'd flagged, every email he'd sent that could be construed as undermining staff members. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing. This wasn't his first time. He'd done this before, to other nurses, other staff members who threatened the carefully constructed hierarchy he'd maintained. This time, though, he'd miscalculated. This time, the person he'd targeted had resources he couldn't see. As security escorted Hargrove from the building later that afternoon, Brooke passed him in the hallway. She was walking toward the cardiac wing, her badge newly reactivated, her back pay approved, her official reinstatement signed by 3 board members and a federal agent. When Hargrove saw her, his mouth opened as if he was going to speak, to explain, to plead, to mount some final argument that might reverse the momentum that had turned against him. But he looked into her eyes, and whatever he was going to say died unspoken. She didn't need to tell him anything. The silence itself was a kind of communication. 6 months later, Brooke returned to the night shift at Mercy General. Her rank was quietly acknowledged among the staff who knew Commander Hayes had arranged for partial disclosure of her service record, enough to verify her background without compromising operational security. Her combat boots, worn and weathered from 18 years of carrying her through impossible terrain, sat tucked under her locker bench where she could see them every time she changed. Sergeant Miller, the ICU patient she'd saved, had recovered fully and sent her a letter thanking Ghost for saving his life twice. Jason visited sometimes, proud to tell people his mom was a veteran, no longer confused about why she kept secrets. One afternoon, a young nurse mentioned seeing Dr. Hargrove teaching CPR at a community college across town, his salary minimum wage, his medical license suspended pending investigation into ethics violations. His institutional power had evaporated, replaced by something far more definitive: irrelevance. Brooke didn't react, just continued charting with the precise focus she'd maintained since arriving. Marcus Chen, the IT director, brought her coffee during a break, a gesture so simple it might have meant nothing. But the look in his eyes, the recognition of one person who'd served seeing another who had, meant everything. As she walked the cardiac wing at 2 in the morning, checking on her patients, Brooke passed the spot where she'd taken down the attacker. The floor was clean. The crash cart had been replaced. But she remembered. And she understood something fundamental: the battles that matter aren't won with speeches or explanations. They're won with action. With quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. With the courage to stand between danger and those who can't protect themselves. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. Like and comment. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?